This is the next in the Patriot Minute series, Connecting with Our Sacred Past. I'm Grandpa Rick. Elijah Ward, my triple great grandfather, came west in 1834 at the age of 21 with the famous American explorer and entrepreneur Nathaniel Wyeth. When Wyeth returned to the east for good, Elijah stayed in the far west. His mentor became the famous mountain man Jim Bridger. He was a fellow Virginian. They knew each other. He married a beautiful Shoshone teenager, Elijah did. Her name was Sally, and they had untold adventures together throughout the Rocky Mountain West, including escaping from a 100-strong Blackfoot raiding party by scaling a 90-foot cliff without ropes and then climbing up and hiding inside of a large bushy fir tree. You know, that account alone should have canonized Elijah, and of course Sally's story as well, as an essential element to better understand the American experience, both Indian and white. This can be found in the book, Torn Between Two Worlds, the story of Elijah and Sally, which I wrote a few years ago on pages 129 through 141, that particular account. Later, leading an allied band of Flathead Indians, Elijah rescued a small family wagon train that had been trapped in a box canyon by Blackfoot raiders. He joined with Kit Carson and explored California all the way to the Pacific. He befriended Washakie, the famous Shoshone peace chief, and helped the Shoshones whenever he could. And then he joined with the Mormons when they arrived in Utah, in the Utah Territory in 1847. He became a close friend and confidant of Brigham Young, and also became his Shoshone and Ute Indian translator and ambassador to the Western tribes. Both he and Sally were instrumental in helping the Mormons survive those early years in the inhospitable Great Basin. He died April 10th, 1865, defending the village of Salina from Chief Blackhawk and his warriors, who attacked the settlers of central Utah in the Black Hawk War that year. On November 7th of 2011, actually, I stood alone in the frozen, windswept cemetery in Salina, Utah, facing the grave of my beloved ancestor Elijah. It was a day I shall not forget. I recorded this event in one of a series of 11 notebooks that I've written while traveling the great state of Utah as part of my job at the time. On that special day, the snow streaked in from the north, came in practically horizontal, in fact, freezing my face and biting at my bared hands. I was not dressed for such weather. The cold penetrated my light clothing, and though it was only early November, it felt like January. Before me stood Elijah's humble gravesite and his tombstone. On it was a sparse description of what was a remarkable life of service, sacrifice, courage, but most of all faith. Eastward stood a long, sloping, bare mountain, which seemed to funnel the wind down through the valley and directly into my face, past the rocks, the bunch grass, the scrub-covered landscape. A few scattered trees that were about were barren. Some appeared to be long since dead in the harsh conditions. In this Great Basin country, you burn in the summer and you freeze in the winter, as I'm sure many of you know. Elijah's grave, that's as I stood there that day, and that winter day, I stood absolutely still. The wind seemed to whisper in my ear a message of dreams unfulfilled, of hopes frustrated by man and nature, young lives cut short. On that day, it was nearly 200 years since his birth in faraway Virginia in the city of Richmond. What a lonely spot to end up here at the ends of the earth and essentially forgotten by both the Mormon people and also a growing nation that both he and Sally had sacrificed their lives to protect and defend. We don't know where Sally is buried, having died also in the service of others. As I stood there, I hesitated to ask, but the free spirit encouraged me. I've always wanted to know, why, Grandpa Elijah? Why did you ride into Soldier Canyon alone that day? The official line was that you went to save the settlement's livestock from Black Hawk and his raiders. Yes, these cows and horses were essential to preserving the lives of the families of those who traveled so far to make a home in this desolate land. And yes, without the community's livestock, children would starve by the next winter. Brigham Young knew that the saints were in a precarious position so far from the Salt Lake Valley and the protection of the Mormon militia. So he sent Elijah alone to the Salina settlement, as he had done so many times before in other settlements, to care for and to protect the weak and to teach these newcomers how to survive on this harsh, stingy, desiccated land. As he always did so faithfully, Elijah came to help the people, to protect them, and to get the job done. These were brand new Scandinavian immigrants, converts to the church. They were shopkeepers, farmers, laborers, and practically none of them owned a gun, let alone knowing how to use one. They came from afar to practice their faith in a free land, to start a new life in America. All of them were poor and in need. Some of them even were survivors. They were widows and orphans of the ill-fated Martin and Willie handcart companies. But still, as I stood there that day, my question remained. If anyone knew the danger of facing Black Hawk's braves alone, it was Elijah. Why take such a risk for people who were not family? They were an immigrant people that the record testifies spoke little English and who struggled to comprehend the dangers that surrounded them. Even more important, I think, to me, was I believe that they had no idea who this Elijah was, his incredible past, and his history of risking his life many times to save the innocent. In other words, I felt from studying their journals and official records that the people of early Salina had no appreciation for this man, his hard-fought knowledge and skills, and the sacrifice that he was about to make. Yet, according to the record, before going after the livestock, he asked several of the townsmen to please go with him, to back him up. All of them refused. All of them were fearful of Black Hawk's braves. Still, and true to form, as he'd committed to Brigham Young, Elijah would not let the people of Salina starve. So he rode out of the protection of the town that day and to his death. Again, why, Grandpa? Why shoulder such a risk? For these people, it appears obvious that they did not appreciate what you were trying to do for them. Then the answer came to my mind, because that's exactly what he'd always done and would always do. He forgave the people of Salina their ignorance. He was sent by Brigham Young to protect and provide for them. He loved them and felt responsible for their safety. He was a man on a mission, a man who I committed to that on that very spot that day as I stood in the cemetery, to always emulate, to stand when others faltered in fear or faithlessness, no matter the consequences, no matter the outcome. As my grandfather used to say, to dig in, to kick it into gear, to get the job done. I remember feeling the tears on my cheeks in the frigid wind that day. My heart ached. How I wished I could have been there that day in 1865 to ride with Grandpa Elijah, to stand with him shoulder to shoulder when he faced the Ute war chief Black Hawk. The account we have says that Elijah Ward confronted Black Hawk and his braves as they tried to steal the town's cattle at the mouth of Soldier Canyon. Then Black Hawk shot Elijah in the face, up close, suddenly, without mercy, without warning. A cowardly act, if ever was, and not worthy of what history has tried to tell us was a great Ute war chief. Elijah was a man who never got rich in the wealth of this world, and he never received the accolades or respect he deserved. As the world modernized, he became just an archaic relic of the past, one whose newcomers from civilized European lands wanted to see put away or buried as quickly as possible. For as soon as his skills and the skills of his loyal wife Sally of the Shoshones were no longer needed and the bad guys vanquished, the West tamed and settled, Their sacrifices on behalf of these new arrivals were quickly pushed aside and forgotten. Or worse, they were ridiculed. Especially today, our children are being taught that these trailblazers of our illustrious past were but racist, slave-holding, land-stealing bigots who need to be erased from our history. And whether we recognize it or not, they are doing this with impunity in our schools and universities everywhere. They are defacing and toppling sacred statues of our national heroes. They are teaching half-truths and lies about our past. Like Gary Cooper in the classic movie High Noon and Alan Ladd in the famous movie Shane, the rough-cut courage and fighting spirit required to tame and secure the Western frontier was discarded as an embarrassment once such raw courage was no longer needed. When Elijah's body was lowered into his grave, the townsfolk forgot about him so quickly that his final resting place, amazingly, was lost to the people of Salina. And it was not rediscovered until many years later, and that was only because Brigham Young had insisted that it be found and preserved. As I turned away from Elijah's forgotten grave that day to get back in the comfort of my car, I whispered a prayer, asking the Lord to please tell Grandpa Elijah and Grandma Sally just how proud I am of them. Their courageous example of service and sacrifice had changed my life from an early age. Good people of Salina and of America, I hope you never forget that others have sacrificed their last full measure of devotion, that you might live in peace, comfort, and freedom. And I'm not just speaking of Elijah or Sally or those who fill your own local cemeteries, but also those Americans buried in faraway, forgotten, yet hallowed grounds the world over. Hundreds of thousands of American citizens, far from home, fill the cemeteries of ground they liberated from fascists, imperialists, and communist thugs and tyrants. More so, I hope that we might reflect on what has been gifted to us for free by others, this legacy of American liberty and prosperity that is so rare in a world filled with oppression, with corruption, with tyranny. But most of all, I hope that we preserve and protect these priceless gifts, sacred gifts from God that He's given us, and to pass them on, offering our children and our grandchildren and our struggling nation and world our own personal legacy of service, sacrifice, courage, and faith. I think in the end, that was all that Elijah and Sally wanted. Thank you for your generous time. Thank you. I'm Grandpa Rick.